Boston that's working on the micro-entrepreneurship end. I'm seeing several of you nodding. I hope some of you will end up in all of these organizations. I am a great fan of Action. I think their work around the globe that began in Latin America is quite astounding. I think we know of Maria Botero, who used to head up Action, who has now gone over towards the State Department side. But I think she really brought that to a whole nother level, where you're looking not just at microcredit. People sometimes say, why just microcredit for women? Why can't they move into the bigger scene? And here they can. I think that organization is one to watch. But is this work not leading also towards durable outcomes, sustainable livelihoods for women? I think it is. But again, I'm curious to see what you all who are grappling with these topics daily are thinking. Thanks a lot.
Well, I think my next question goes to, I think, something that came out of what many of you have talked about. There are a lot of great examples, programmatic examples, policy examples, and I'm sure many of you in the audience will have questions about them and other approaches as we move forward. But I think there are still people who argue that, you know, gender is not the most important way to look at development. And there may be some of you in this room, I might doubt it, but and there may be some people at the conference who say that. But in general, there is that train of thought. So I guess I'd like to start with Brenda and move down to Carla. How do we address that kind of barrier, which is a barrier of not seeing this as a critical development path? What are the best ways to address that barrier and overcome it and win over converts?
You had several questions, as Carla would say. Thank you. I am reminded by Stephanie's comment of the issue of invisibility. The invisibility of women's work in development and women's involvement, period, day to day. Ata Aidu, the former education minister in Ghana, who's also a novelist and is now at Brown University, said this. She said, well, the women of Ghana in West Africa, they start before sunup, they work until sundown, they never stop. And yet the biggest indignity is that the policymakers and decision makers don't even see their contributions. And that is perhaps the biggest privation of all, that working nonstop, they're not even recognized. And she goes on to say, you would think the African women would simply fold their arms and fall down and die, but far from that. So I think invisibility is one that's really tough in terms of the barrier to recognizing and building in action that's sensitive to gender issues. Now, UN Development Program last year sat up and realized that an important index that we have been using over the years, the Gender Development Index, that came out around 95 by the late and great Mahbub al-Haq, who famous for his expression, development if not engendered is endangered. And that index put a gender lens then on the Human Development Index that looks at education, longevity, and incomes. Now, they were finding that on the Gender Development Index, the country would go up a notch or two or down a notch or two. Gender, apparently, no big deal. Why are we bothering looking at this issue? So UNDP came out last year with a new index called the Gender Inequality Index. I find it's quite a fascinating one. It brings in mortality, reproductive health issues from the side for women. You could say, well, how are we comparing women and men and bringing in reproductive health, maternal mortality, or adolescent fertility? And yet, you can also say, as was intimated earlier too by Jishnu, that this indeed is a societal issue if you've got high maternal mortality or adolescent fertility. And then they continue with not primary education this time, but secondary and above, labor force participation, and political voice. Again, where's our outrage? Political voice, women parliamentarians were 60% on average globally. What is going on? In most countries, we've at least achieved the right to vote, but apparently we're either not putting women, is it always that we think we're putting in feminist men? That could be. Barack Obama, I consider a feminist. His first piece of legislation was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which was for equal pay, and then subsequent legislation came to put teeth into it. But nonetheless, 16%, this is outrageous. I guess, and we're not even getting out to vote, so that makes it even worse. I'm going to then, what was the second part of your question, Stephanie? Although my time may be up now. Attention to gender. Did I cover it enough? Okay, thanks a lot. Over to Jishnu.
I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I think.
That's honest.
I mean,
We like honesty. But we like honesty.
you know, particularly being at a place like the World Bank, I think we have to be exceedingly cautious in advancing or trying to intervene in one particular area or the other, right? So I really think one of the things that we should be doing, and the World Bank is doing a lot of, is contributing to, you know, fundamentally democratic debates in the countries that we work in, and not necessarily advocating one thing or the other. I think a lot of gender issues are actually national issues that there will be national debate about and a national consensus about. And the issue is there a role for the global community on these things? And I think we take a fairly strong stance to say there is, right? And part of that role has to do with the production of knowledge. Part of that role has to do with direct funding in places where it matters. So for instance, believe it or not, creating a fund for HIV/AIDS and making sure that a lot more people got HIV/AIDS medication has saved more women's lives and has been one of the biggest bang for the buck in terms of gender equality worldwide. And I think the global community played a very strong role in it. So my sense would be there are enormous opportunities here, but the opportunities need to be tempered with some caution and with enormous humility about how to go forward on this. I mean, looking at the history of where things have changed, one of the very fascinating group of work that's come out is really looking at the political process and how this affects gender equality. And I want to kind of point you to three pieces, both from the US and from India. Turns out, so if you look at, you know, again, coming back to female mortality, I mean, if you look at when things started changing in the US, it was essentially around the time that women got the vote, right? So there's this fantastic paper from Grant Miller who shows, and one of the landmark acts here was the Shepard-Towner Act. And there's this speech by the senator who says if the vote on the Shepard-Towner Act had been taken behind closed doors, it would not have passed. So this is an act about sanitation and clean water. But now, 50% of my electorate is women. And they really want clean water and sanitation. There's no way I can say no. Right? So we know that part of the way things have moved forward is by active political participation from women. We also know that part of what's driven legislation, and here the evidence you may or may not agree with it, I'd love to know what you think, is the way men in patriarchal societies have viewed the trade-off, and I'm being crude here, right? So bear with me. This is the way the paper puts it, is the trade-off between control over spouses versus a better life for their daughters, right? But it turns out, if you look at the US legislature, the legislators who have more daughters tend to be more supportive of women's legislation for women's rights on various fronts, right? And that's a process that Rafael Fernandez documents, showing that when the ability of women to garner resources increases, right, in patriarchal societies, men start caring a lot more about making sure that their daughters have control, right, than that they have control of their spouses. So I think there are these very complicated changes that happen, and combining that kind of with the Indian experience of saying one other way of getting the impacts of universal vote is to start changing the identity of political legislators. We're starting to get a fairly robust sense of how these national changes happen, right? And I think one of the roles that the international community can play is really fostering these kind of exchanges where we start thinking very seriously about what are the pieces that you need to put in place to develop a robust debate on these issues, kind of foster what I think is an inherently democratic process on moving forward on these issues.
I was on a panel at the World Bank earlier this week where the moderator said he became a feminist when he had a daughter. So it's anecdotal evidence of what you're pointing to. I think the other piece that is supportive of the analysis you present is the most recent Panchayat research, which also shows an increase in, I'll speak lightly, an increase in aspirations for girls and girls' education as a result of the increased presence of women in leadership positions at the local level in India. I sort of think of myself within USAID as a chief advocate for gender issues and issues related to women's empowerment. So the issue you raise in your question about how you overcome attitudes of people that feel that this is really not a critical issue is one that's close to my heart and that I think about on a daily basis. And I think, first of all, it's critical that we not always be preaching to the choir. And I am enormously appreciative of everybody in this room today, but I think that the demographic mix in this room is indicative of the problem that we face. The percentage of men in the room today is actually better than the percentage of men in many rooms I speak to on a regular basis. So how am I approaching it? First of all, you can't cede the ground on the fact that women have rights. Jishnu said it perfectly when he said, you cannot have to be forced to always make the economic or political argument for why women shouldn't be beaten in their homes. Certain things are just, women's rights are human rights, and we cannot cede that ground. At the same time, increasingly, I think the business case and the case that we've been making at this table, combining the human rights case with the business case, the overwhelming and growing body of statistical evidence that points to this as being an essential precondition for successful and sustainable development is really important. And it is very important for those who are not necessarily converted to the cause, either because they believe that this is a human rights issue or because they care deeply about women's rights for whatever reason. And so I think that that's part of it. From an institutional perspective, my approach is I mandate it. That is, it doesn't really matter whether you believe me, you must do it. While I try to convince people that we need to move it forward. So in transforming the work that USAID does around this issue, we have wholly rewritten every strategy and policy related to this. We released on March 1st an updated policy on gender equality and female empowerment. It was preceded about a week earlier by a new policy on counter-trafficking in persons. It is accompanied by a national action plan on women, peace, and security, which will be followed up by an implementation plan for the U.S. Agency for International Development on women, peace, and security. And it is followed by a strategy that will be forthcoming on combating gender-based violence. So we have wholly rewritten those policies, and we have written very specific mandates into it that say that senior management is responsible for implementing this policy, and they will be, or policies and strategies, and they will be held accountable for moving this agenda forward. And yes, we want to measure results so that we see what the impact is, but even if we don't see all the results right now, because it hasn't been fully incorporated into our monitoring evaluation, we still must implement these policies and these strategies, and the results will follow. And that's something that we take quite seriously. And are thinking about how we operationalize it and how we give the tools to our staff to enable them to do what it is we're asking them to do. The last thing I want to mention is that the point Jishnu made very earlier about measuring outcomes is a really important one, and it's one approach to really weaving this into the fabric of an organization and making people think critically about this issue and its relevance to broader development outcomes. The other thing that we've done in our policy is say that what we are about is closing gaps. And those gaps exist on many levels, but one of the largest gaps that exist in many societies around the world are gaps between men and women on in very important sectoral issues. Whether that's gaps in income, gaps in employment, gaps in voting rights, gaps in education, gaps in health outcomes. And it was very interesting when we were first talking through the policy. You go to all of these sessions inside an organization and everybody's sort of nodding off and listening to you halfway. And I presented a piece of paper and it said one of our goals is to close gaps. And we want to close these gaps in achievement because we want to lift all boats as part of our development policy and our development strategy. And the gentleman looked up and he said, suddenly, that's very controversial. And I said, oh, I got your attention, that's good, because now you're thinking about what the implications are of this for development. So those are some of the tools and strategies and techniques we're using.
Well, very good. I now, first of all, I think we should give our panelists a round of applause. And I'm now going to turn this over to you all. We have a mic that we're going to be taking around, so if you have a question, please raise your hand. Please don't be shy. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and so I'll kind of go back and forth between sides of the room and back and forth to the extent I can see you. So I'm going to start with you because you had your hand up first, and then we'll come to this side of the room. And please tell us your name, and also if this is a question for all of the panelists or just if you have a particular question for a panelist.
My name is Amy Vidyani. I'm a master's student at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you very much for your time today. And so my outrage lies in the fact that, yes, there are barriers to empowerment of women in developing countries, but also here, with what's happening here with social media. And specifically, I think, it's tough to phrase, but how women are perceived here and viewed more as objects in social media. The representation in Congress here is at a very low percentage. So if we want to advance U.S. foreign policy, what are we doing here at home to be a good role model in the international arena? That's my question. And it's more for everyone.
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, we often, and we face that question when we're talking about issues related to women's rights abroad as well, because it's always a work in progress anywhere in the world on a whole number of different, in a number of different ways, a number of different realms and sectors. I think that what's interesting, I noticed when I first came back into government about a year ago, was actually that the number of women in senior level positions had risen enormously. And I think that one of my jobs is to look within the agency as well and think about women within U.S. foreign policy and how we elevate that. What we see within the U.S. government is, or within USAID, is that we now have a majority of hires that are women. So at entry level, we're about 60% female, and then that decreases as you rise up. It's sort of pyramidal, although it doesn't get that thin. It gets to about between 30 and 40% at senior management levels. Now, if you count political appointees as opposed to senior career officials, political appointees is virtually even. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but they're even men and women. And so the question then becomes, why is it that in our career ranks we have this issue? And there are a number of things to think about, but one interesting thing that I think is an issue in the formal government structures in which I move right now is that in some ways it's become about the flexible workplace for families, and it's actually less about women versus men, but what the expectations are for a flexible environment in which you can work, and that people make choices now that are quite different. And I don't think that the federal government environment has caught up yet to what the expectations are of working families, whether they're men or women. And so you have people making choices which are to do different things, continuing to work in international affairs, but not in an environment that makes them rotate every 3 years, or forces them to have a spouse that trails, because there isn't the kind of hiring scope for those spouses. whether that spouse is male or female, where the roles or and expectations of a spouse for when they are the husband or wife or partner of a mission director is no longer hosting teams, or an ambassador's husband or wife. And that causes a whole set of additional complications that we haven't yet caught up with in terms of the work environment. So I think there are some structural issues. We're trying to deal with them, but some of them are really quite daunting in terms of adaptability.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on, thanks for a great question, the media and the representation of women in this country can be really deplorable. We were just discussing it last week with my students. We were discussing, do you know those Bratz dolls ads? I mean, where you've got these little dolls that are adults and they are really quite pornographic. Or I was buying a bottle of Perrier in Paris. I was rushing, just grabbed my little plastic bottle because it was light. Okay, what do I see on the bottle? Dita Fonti. She's in a burlesque outfit, and it's really, again, quite pornographic and I would say disgusting. On the upside, though, I like to look at models, and I'll take someone like Madeleine Albright. I loved her TED interview she gave not too long back, because she was quoting her granddaughter, who said, well, what's the big deal that Grammy's Secretary of State? Girls are always Secretary of State. In her lifetime, of course, it had always been, quote, girls. And Madeleine then went on, though, to say, and I liked the quote, that there should be a special place reserved in hell for women who do not support other women. Coming back to one of my hobby horses here. Solution. I think it's important that you all get involved in the communications end and the media end, and not simply go to USAID or the UN and the World Bank. Important as that is, but some of you really need to get out there and be in the media world and bring these causes forward. And then I'll just give you one other tip too. My former colleague of the UN and still with the UN, Ar Sudarshan, is here. He's going to be heading up a new policy institute outside of Delhi. So lobby him too to do something on his communications end with a big gender focus. Thanks a lot.
Great, okay, let's go. Is there on this side of the room? I see. Sure, in the front here. We need a mic. I'm not sure where the mic is.
My name is Nagendra. I am from Clark University, Worcester. Listening from the panelists, I have a lot of questions in my mind right now because I came from a middle class family from India. Whatever reasons you discussed here, I am quite agreeable to that. But I differ to some reasons behind what you have discussed that. Because when we talk about gender bias, it is more prevalent in highly educated families. As you spoke of Punjab, Punjab is a highly educated state, and the income is more. But the women of Punjab, they enjoy less privilege than their female counterpart in tribal areas. The tribal women, they enjoy more independence than the elite groups. Why? So I think there are certain reasons behind we need to discuss. But my personal perception is that it is not the causes, maybe the one named the causes, but there are some social structural mindset in the women, particularly when, suppose, let me give an example. If a family has 2 children, female and male, and the family is a middle income group, and if you ask, both the children, they are studying well. But when it comes to the career choice path, the mother wants that money should be invested behind the child, and the boy child, not the girl child. So don't you think that in the female psychology that really insists, that really aggravate this gender bias in India? Particularly because I have worked 17 years in this gender sector. Women never have a final say. Even in the elite group, educated group, women never enjoy a final say, I mean final decision. It is social constructed mechanism, and what you spoke of that emancipating gender is not an event, rather it takes process, it's a process. So, I am wondering that what are the other causes behind these? What causes we discussed here? There are some different issues, different reasons that need to discuss in this international forum. Thank you.
Excuse me, can the moderator rephrase the question, please? I'm sorry, I had a very hard time understanding.
Okay.
No, can the moderator just summarize, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
I think what I took from the question, and I know I'm going to mangle it a little bit, but is sort of looking at the class overtones to this discussion. And I think you specifically mentioned in India, women in tribal areas may actually, have a sort of, there may be sort of more equality or more of a participatory nature of their involvement in society, and to discuss that and really comment on it.
I think the danger in any global discussion is that you create vast generalizations. So I think there are many examples. I was with the Maasai community in Kenya and had a really extremely interesting conversation about female genital mutilation with, and it was the older women in the conversation who needed to be convinced. And it was the younger women in the conversation from the Maasai community who convinced them. And when you look at the Hakama singers in Sudan, who sing to send their men off to war, you see how there are these cultural antecedents which can run counter to the general global generalization about women being progressive, oriented towards rights, and so I think that what you're saying is very true. And what it means is that when we're approaching this issue, it needs to be done with local contextualization, attention to how conversations run among men and women and boys and girls within communities. It needs to tap into the leadership within those communities, whether it's male or female, and really listen to those signals in moving an agenda forward. And often some of the most influential people will be male elders and male allies, and it will not necessarily be the obvious stereotypical strategy for moving an agenda forward. So I completely agree with everything you're saying.
Just to cap, two points I wanted to make. I mean, one is, I think we have to be sufficiently nuanced about generalizations, not only across countries, but across attitudes. I mean, remember the Punjabi households are also the most entrepreneurial in terms of they were the first in Delhi to have women employed in call centers that were working overnight, right? I mean, so, on the one hand, we know that that's where the worst prenatal sex determination is happening. On the other hand, they're completely open to exceedingly entrepreneurial choices for their girls, and very responsive to market returns, right? And how we weigh each of these is going to depend on choices that we don't want to possibly make. I mean, I really don't know how to respond to that. But the other point I want to make is, look, I mean, this is something we were discussing earlier on the panel, which is culture is deeply malleable. I mean, it's not that culture is fixed, right? And sometimes it changes very, very fast. And I want to give you one example, right? I mean, in Turkey, there were quite a few girls who were out of school, right? And there was a survey which said, why are girls out of school? Well, it's 2,000 years of culture, right? I mean, we don't send our girls to school. Turns out that if you gave what's called a conditional cash transfer, which is I'll give you some money as long as you send your girl to school, it costs about 50 cents to overturn 2,000 years of culture, right? I mean, give the same families 50 cents, and lo and behold, tomorrow all the girls are going to school, right? Mumbai, why do you not vote for women? Oh, women cannot be good leaders. Turns out you have 3 years of reservation, remove the reservation, women are equally likely to be voted as men, right? So in a lot of cases, we are seeing deeply malleable cultures, right? And this is not to say that that's the case everywhere. And I think there have been very smart strategies over time. For example, the foot binding in Shanghai, which was really a fascinating example of using a matching market, which is to say you need to change the men to say we're not going to marry women with particular characteristics and change female attitudes. Was, I think, a fascinating example of how to move forward in changing culture. But I think, again, as you were saying, these are very locally specific. These are nuanced across sectors. You might have the same family being completely open about something and completely closed about something else. And I think this is, again, something that requires a delicacy of touch in moving forward here.
Perhaps I shouldn't speak after my Punjabi colleague, but thank you so very much for your comments. I just wanted to flag a study that was done in India called, under the auspices of the UN, called Women in India, How Free, How Equal. And I want to come to mindsets, and again back to my hobby horse of women's agency. And they quoted a family survey carried out by the government of India in one of the states, where women were explaining how they felt that it was okay to be beaten for a certain number of causes. It was okay to be beaten if they burned the food, or if they went out without asking permission, or if they would perhaps have insulted the in-laws, etc. And it would range from 60% to 30%, but it was pretty startling that the women themselves were saying that this was okay. And in other countries too, we were finding the same phenomenon. And then I come to this situation where apparently, and it's, I believe, an underestimation, 1/3 of the world's women are assaulted, beaten, murdered, etc., or subject to a harmful practice like harmful traditional practice like female genital mutilation in their lifetimes, 1 in 3. I mean, where's our outrage? It is extraordinary. Trafficking, 30 million women and girls trafficked every year. 30 million rather are out there trafficked, 2 million added every year, and 80% of those are female, half are children. I mean, and the US is a big demanding partner, the biggest in the industrialized world. So I think the mindsets for me are really phenomenal, and I'm happy to hear Jishnu speak of some positives on it, how one can change mindsets. And there are great groups out there like Polaris or the Say No campaign of the Secretary General to tackle some of these problems like violence against women. But I think we should not just be pointing our fingers at the men, but right back at ourselves. Thank you.
I just want to say one quick thing myself, and then I'm going to take 3 questions as a final kind of grouping of questions to ask the panelists. Just as an aside, I was in Haiti last month. I was the facilitator for a big conference of women coming up with a women's policy platform for Haiti, which was phenomenally successful. Interestingly, though, it was preceded by 315 focus groups around the country of women and men. And again, asking the question, what are the needs of women in the reconstruction? I mean, we should be asking this all the time, but this was a specific women-led conversation. And interestingly, gender-based violence, addressing gender-based violence not only did it not rise to the top or even the middle, it was very much at the bottom. And I think there's this question, too, of who's in the room when the question is asked, because there were men in the groups. There was sometimes a question of whether or not that sort of, made people feel like they didn't want to have the discussion. And also the issue of given the range of problems in a society like that, how women perceive what's important. Not to say that women, I think, and I don't want to speak for them, think that gender-based violence is okay, but when you're looking at a plethora of problems, how do you prioritize? And I think there are a lot of nuances that I learned from that experience, bringing my own biases, of course, to it. So I think it's a very complicated set of responses that women and men have to the issues that they face. So, okay, I'm going to take 3 questions and then pose them to the panel. So let's go in the very, very back here. The woman in the very, very last row. I'm going to go with you, and then I'll this gentleman here, and then the woman on the side, and then we will pose those 3 questions to the panel.
Hi, I'm Shannon Rosenberg from the Maxwell School up at Syracuse. And I have a question for Mr. Doss. You mentioned conditional cash transfers as a kind of successful program, but I'm working in a seminar course right now with 2 of my colleagues who are here. And we have a few concerns about conditional cash transfers and kind of the incentive structure that they create in the long term. There seems to be a focus now for just kind of any way possible to get girls into school without thinking in the long term, like what is this creating as an incentive structure? In the end, when the cash runs out or stops, there's no incentive to send the girls to school anymore if there's no more cash. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about sustainability of that.
Great. And this second question goes to this gentleman here. You can get him a mic, perhaps?
Actually, I have a really loud voice.
Oh, good. So. Yes, you do. So then we'll give the mic to that woman. She's next after you.
I know that global generalizations are really hard and oftentimes not useful. But having recently been introduced to the girleffect.org and the work of Ramin Beg, I'm somehow looking for one of those generalizations that's about the either societal incentive or economic incentive that will help us get behind women's role in development. And so I was just wondering, I know the generalizations are hard, but something concrete to push back on that.
Thank you. And yes.
Hi, my name is Ayani Azaki. I'm a student at Brown University. First, I had a comment from Ms. Sweeney. I just wanted to inform her that I think in my generation, Zeta Nonsense is like widely admired as an advocate for self-confidence and like body positivity. So I would like to get to your earlier language. And my actual question is directed at Ms. Koppel. What is your agency or other federal agencies doing to get the United States to ratify CEDAW? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think, why don't we just have everyone answer the second question, which is the generalization question, and then to the extent there was a question directed at you specifically, just use that time to answer that question as well. We'll let the person in the middle start this time. How radical? Never say we're not radical on this panel.
Yeah, so CCD and sustainability, I think that's a big topic, one I'm happy to discuss. All I wanted to point out with that CCD is apparently if you bribe people to send their girls to school, they send them regardless of their culture. Whether that's sustainable or not, I think we have examples from various countries. I mean, we can talk afterwards, happy to do that. I want to point you out to Brazil, right? I mean, so Brazil really used CCTs to change the structure of the economy, right? So if you look at poverty elasticity to growth in Brazil, it's dramatically gone up over the last 10 years, which means every time that Brazil's grown over the last 10 years, the poor have grown a lot more than they used to before, and a lot of it's been attributed to these kind of conditional cash transfers. So I'm happy to kind of talk to you in some detail about that. I'm not I don't have a view on whether we should be doing this everywhere or not. Just comes with effect. I just want to respond to generalizations of the girl effect. I mean, look, I would be really cautious moving down that route, right? You guys might have seen the recent evaluation of the girl effect. They're basically saying unless they shape up, they're going to cut off all funding, right? Because it's not the way to go forward. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's a huge danger from saying empowering women produces growth. That evidence is not good, that evidence is not correct. And I think there's a big danger that says, the criticism down the line, which will be, well, that's just not there. That's not correct. And I think we have to be very, very careful in saying, we have to take the evidence that's good and that's defensible in moving forward on this. And if they're not going to be generalizations, they're not going to be generalizations, and that's fine.
Thanks. I would like to toss into the mix alongside Grameen the Azim Premji Foundation. Premji may not be a name as known as Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but he was the #3 richest some years back, and he's put $2 billion into his foundation, and it focuses on primary education. One theme, not a whole string of themes. And why? Because he feels that education in India is turning out people who are memorizing and learning by rote, not critical thinkers, problem solvers, those who can work in teams. And since he's a software exporter, they've come up with amazing use of the information communications technologies for development, in my view, and especially for girls too. But the software they had for little kids using the computers to me was just amazing. I was blown away. And they're retraining primary school teachers both in the public sector and the private. Martha Nussbaum, when we roped her into a study recently, we were looking to 2060 and what are the trigger factors we should push on. Martha Nussbaum, the Chicago philosopher who's done so much in human development and the capabilities approach. And we asked her, well, if you were to choose just 1 or 2 or 3 things to really make a difference for girls and women, what would you choose? And she said, basic schooling for girls, but to prepare them for critical thinking. So I really come back to the education and groups like Azim Premji Foundation, but others who can make that sort of a difference. Thank you.
regard to the conditional cash transfer, I think that one thing to bear in mind is that I've had some of the same questions regarding sustainability and those issues, but in analyzing it, you should also think about the broader context. And some of the returns to even minimal levels of education for development, apart from whether or not it's sustainable or whether that individual girl stays in school for the rest of her career. The other thing I would say is that we have seen, in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, most progress in terms of primary education in closing gaps between girls and boys, and it's important to bear that in mind as one of the places where we actually have made the most progress overall. With regard to CEDAW, obviously the ratification is dependent upon the U.S. Congress, and given the current congressional environment, there's little likelihood that CEDAW is going to move forward for ratification. That having been said, I think the most important thing we can say with regard to the U.S. government is that we seek to move forward with de facto implementation of CEDAW, even in absence of its ratification in the United States. And so those values, the spirit of CEDAW, and the call to action embodied in CEDAW are things which are incredibly important to this administration and that we're sort of working daily to move forward. Finally, with regard to these specific interventions, whether it's Girl Effect or Green Bank, I think that you started the comment saying that it's hard to generalize globally, and I think that it's also hard, and we should be cautious to identify a single example that we use to make a case, particularly on this topic where we see such an enormous and growing body of evidence that is not initiative-based, but is rather studies in the field and studies around the broader economic and developmental benefits, social and political, of investments in women and girls. And so rather than hanging our hat on one initiative or whether or not that initiative has been effective and the extent to which that effectiveness is sustainable and long-term, we should be looking at the broad swath of evidence in that increasingly compelling case that drives us forward. Since I'm closing the panel, I mean, what I would say is our collective obligation is really to help to enable more people to understand how integral the questions we've been discussing this morning are to the broader conversations about international development, well-being, peace, and prosperity. Until we can really integrate this conversation into all the conversations that are taking place today and at other conferences around this agenda, we will not be able to achieve success, because it really needs to be a fundamental premise of the way we, as a collective set of development professionals, think about the way we do work and move the agenda forward. And just before the panel, we were talking about the fact that the opening plenary was incredibly interesting and stimulating discussion, and that the only time issues related to gender or women came up was whether or not it was good that Ngozi, as a candidate for president of the World Bank, was a woman, and whether it was good that they mentioned that she was a woman, or whether it should instead have been a discussion about who's most qualified to be president of the World Bank. We need to do better as a community. We need these conversations to come up regularly. We need them to come up in our conversations about whether we are successfully promoting political, economic, and social development, and it shouldn't only be in the conversation about gender. So that's my close.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I want to thank the panel. And I want to thank all of you. I think this is a tremendously exciting time to be interested in working in this area. Change, we all think change happens slowly on a daily basis, but really when you think about where we find ourselves in 2012, we're in a remarkably different place than we were even, say, at the Beijing World Conference on Women, with then First Lady Hillary Clinton made the then very radical comment that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. I say that only to say that actually I think there's been rapid change. There's also been some backlash, back and forth. Change is not a straight line. And change in this arena where we're looking at really how we deal with generations and years and 5 years of different roles that men and women have been assigned by our societies is the kind of change that's very fundamental. And so these are the critical questions.
I think, in development going forward. And again, this is an exciting time. It's an exciting time for all of us, and I hope for all of you, and I hope that you continue to be interested in the topic. And we will be here for a bit if you want to ask some questions for the panelists. And again, thank you for coming, and thank you to the great panelists.
Just two brief announcements. First, your next stop, as many of you probably know, is lunch. Several of our panelists will be hosting what we're calling networking lunches, which are small conversations. So please, on your way out, pick up a box lunch. There are 3 options over there, and make your way. All of the different lunch options are listed in your program. And finally, I would like to ask all of you to join me one more time in thanking our tremendous panel and our great moderator for a truly conversation.